Hello ladies and gentlemen, I hope I'm going live about now. My iPad has not yet confirmed that to me, but I'll remain optimistic that the stream will work just as well as it did yesterday. We didn't have any technical hiccups. We had some audio issues related to the original video from the DOJ and their press conference, but that was hardly my fault. My audio worked fine, so let's hope that our luck continues for this stream. I don't know how long this video will be. I'll probably not be going through the entire document, all 88 pages today from the DOJ filing. I have no idea why my Apple Watch just decided to ignore my do not disturb. Okay, but I hope that everything still works. I hope that the message didn't screw up the feed from my iPhone video, and now my iPad shows me that everything is working as well. Thank you all for the support for yesterday's video. We are at about 500 views now, which is really good, given that, as I said, my channel had quite a hiatus that really hurt us with the YouTube algorithm. I hope that more people over time will also be able to find me live, but I'm more than happy with you guys finding me afterwards. As always, feel free to comment, like, subscribe, share, and if you're really enjoying the content, please consider leaving a super chat or a super sticker. Any kind of support, even just watching the video, is very much supported. Now, it's very much appreciated, of course. Now, we have talked yesterday about some of the pretty ridiculous claims that the DOJ made about Apple, about Apple's history overall, about Apple's almost 15 years of gratuitous, monopolistic, basically violence against its competition. Now, we had already a response from Apple. I did not feel like reading it yesterday because I thought to myself, well, what's really the point if I'm already pretty much giving all their points, but I'll just briefly go through what Apple has said. I don't think there's anything surprising here. This is a statement they shared with Mac Rumors. I think this is a statement that in this shape or another we'll see a lot throughout the coming weeks and months. Joseph, to joining minute one, basically. I very much appreciate your support, man. Most loyal viewer on the channel here. Welcome. Apple's statement, right, is about how the company vows to vigorously defend itself, saying that the lawsuit is wrong on the facts and the law, which is hilarious. I don't know about the law. As I said, I'm not a resident or citizen of the United States, though I do have a keen interest in US law for many weird reasons that pertain to my personality disorders. Wrong on the facts, I can definitely speak to that, as I have studied Apple for basically 15 years. I have written essays about Apple. I've commented about them multiple times online in very serious manners, and obviously I have this channel. That none of that makes me an expert and doesn't mean I have a doctoral dissertation in Apple studies, but I think I'm quite qualified to speak on that. In many ways, significantly higher qualified than any of the clowns that we saw yesterday try to talk down Apple's historical contributions to technology, innovation, the broader market, developer and content, app and content distribution, and the list goes on and on. Now, what has Apple said directly here, or at least over Mac Rumors? Well, Apple says that at Apple, we innovate every day to make technology people love, designing products that work seamlessly together, protect people's privacy and security, and create a magical experience for our users. This lawsuit threatens who we are and the principles that set Apple products apart in fiercely competitive markets. If successful, it would hinder our ability to create the kind of technology people expect from Apple, where hardware, software, and services intersect. It would also set a dangerous precedent, empowering government to take a heavy hand in designing people's tech. We believe this lawsuit is wrong on the facts and the law, and we will vigorously defend against it. So, they do point out some facts here that are basically pretty much also in the lawsuit complaint that we'll be reading. It's basically about the U.S. District Court, New Jersey, the Justice Department, 16 other U.S. states. So basically, it's quite a big suit here. We will also go through the particular examples given because they're more in more detail outlined in the actual complaint by the DOJ. So nothing about Apple's response here is particularly surprising. Not only are those pretty much well used and well known mannerisms and responses by Apple, but by any means and logic, this is how Apple operates, right? This isn't just stuff that Apple says, but devices interacting together, bringing software and services and hardware together. This is how Apple has been operating at what Steve Jobs once called the intersection of technology and liberal arts. With liberal arts does not just mean that it's the art behind creating music, movies, TV shows, books, apps, but also the art that goes into creating stuff like the operating system user interface, everything from your icons, the gestures, the animations, the broader sense of fluidity and smoothness as you experience with iOS, regardless if you have a 60 and 90 or 120 hertz display. It basically all comes together. It just works. Now, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's not as good as you would expect. Sometimes it's not worth the money. Criticism towards Apple absolutely is valid. Apple is not perfect, and Apple is rich enough to deal with some criticism without starting to cry, believe me. But as I've said time and time again, and as the internet likes to point out, countering people like me, I am saying that truth and facts are for everyone. They're not just for the underdogs. If you are a big company, if you are a rich individual, you still deserve the law, the truth, and the facts to be on your side if they are so, right? Of course, if you're rich, you can be an asshole, you can try to bend the law to your advantage, you can bribe people, you can blackmail people so that the facts start to look more to your favor and stuff like that. But that's not what we're talking about. I'm talking about a cold, hard analysis of the facts and arguments provided by the DOJ, how I can counter it, how Apple can counter it, how anyone with even the slightest knowledge of Apple's history and their products can counter them. And to me, I think that Apple's argument that this is wrong on the law, I cannot speak to that. We'll see how that goes. I think the judges will not very much enjoy this lawsuit. I think this lawsuit is very, very discombobulated. There's a lot of inconsistency there. There are a lot of weird arguments there that are incredibly easy to destroy, but maybe some of it does have foundations. And on terms of the facts, yes, this is where we'll attack it. This is where we'll analyze it. As I've said, I have accepted that when we went yesterday through what they said and we made a lot of notes, and I'm still looking for a better notes app, basically. We've said that some of the facts were correct. Some of the arguments might be a little bit fair at the very least. But we have also said that the vast majority of what they've outlined so far is weird, barely correct, or a downright lie on what is happening. And we'll continue with that today. So I think that Apple's response was kind of a good baseline for us to get into the topic. And before we get fully into it, as always, cheers. And I'll briefly turn myself off so you don't hear me drinking like last time. So, Apple's response, nothing surprising about that. Feel free to ask me any questions you might have. Feel free to point out if there are any problems with the stream, as always. And let us get back to the actual meat on the bone here. This is the complaint by the DOJ, and this is where we stopped yesterday, because this is where they have started to present concrete examples of they say it that way. It's really not true, about how Apple's monopoly basically stifles competition. Let's continue there. Part 10. This complaint highlights 5 examples of Apple using this mechanism, which basically were broader, like anti-competitive mechanisms, like using contractual restrictions and fees and stuff like that, suppress technologies that would have increased competition among smartphones. Suppressing these technologies does not reflect competition on the merits. I'm sorry, I have to take another drink. I was talking so much today that my throat is just completely dry. I'm sorry. Does not reflect competition on the merits, rather to protect its smartphone monopoly. By the way, this is 100% wrong. Apple does not have a smartphone monopoly. Apple has a dominant, even majority market share of smartphones in the United States. But as I've said time and time again, they are mistaking 2 arguments that are used by people online. Like when Tim Sweeney talks about an Apple monopoly, he does not mean that there are no alternatives to iPhone. He means that the App Store is a monopoly for app distribution on iPhone, and that with the App Store also come monopolistic practices when it comes to any kind of other app, like your banking apps, your content distribution apps, right? This is the argument. There is no smartphone monopoly by Apple. Yes, Apple is by far the most important smartphone company in the United States, but Apple also has a similar amount of market share in Japan. And it's not like they were leveraging like their regional powers there. It just happens that some markets, especially markets that have pretty high income levels, respond very favorably to Apple hardware. So they're like just on this like brief combining those 2 words together, I as a judge would already be like throwing this into their faces and telling them, look, I'm not throwing this out, but you have to rewrite this bullshit. And the extraordinary profits that monopoly generates. This is so stupid. You can generate profits even without being a monopoly. The iPhone hardware in of itself sells really well, even before you consider income from the App Store or anything else like that. Like Microsoft does not technically hold a monopoly on like the server market, right? But Azure generates crazy profits. You can argue that maybe Microsoft bought up so many potential competitors at this point that maybe in some ways it's a monopoly, but there's like Google Cloud, there's obviously Amazon Web Services, so you can generate a lot of profit without being a monopoly. This is not an actual argument, this is an appeal to emotion and to internet talking points. Apple repeatedly chooses to make its products worse for consumers to prevent competition from emerging. This doesn't even make sense. Like, yes, I know what they mean. It's like, oh, if they made this API, then a competitor would emerge, and their products would be better for it, but then that competitor could, like, what, create smartphones to compete with Apple at that point? Or is it that this competitor would potentially, like, not pay at least the 30% commission rate or something like that? This is circular logic, by the way. This is a completely unfounded argument. If anything, is Apple makes its products better or more restricted. By the way, restrictive does not necessarily make a product worse. Having a product be more restrictive is inherently superior for its security, its privacy, its ease of use. Yes, it does have its downsides, but it doesn't make a product inherently worse. The fact that they are using always, by the way, words like worse and not stuff like restrictive or even locked down or limited. As I said before, this entire bullshit is an appeal to emotions and not actually like a cohesive, logical, legal argument. These examples below, individually and collectively, have contributed to Apple's ability to secure, grow, and maintain its smartphone monopoly by increasing switching costs for users. I've actually highlighted that yesterday, that their main point they seem to be making here is that switching is hard, right? And we'll get to that once we reach like point 188 or something. Yeah, it will get ridiculous, guys. And the switching here seems to be primarily about switching to other smartphone brands, and very little so to actually other services, which is weird because I think that this is a far stronger legal argument against Apple to point out that it's like you cannot switch from the App Store to, let's say, the Epic Game Store if it ever came to the iPhone or something like that. That maybe even an app like Spotify could have problems competing with Apple Music because one is pre-installed and already using all the payment methods. It does not have to pay a commission, be it 30 or 15%, right? But they primarily limited to smartphones, which is weird. Which leads to higher prices and less innovation for users and devs. Apple has used one or both mechanism, control of app distribution or control of APIs. It's their platform, control of APIs. Yes, since the first days of the iPhone, Steve Jobs, even before the App Store existed, was really hardcore about having only like natively controlled and Apple maintained APIs on the system, because everything else can cause it to crash, can contribute to lowering security, privacy, might break more likely once there's a software update. It makes it far more difficult for Apple to actually like guarantee a broader level of support for distributed applications. This was covered over and over again, like by the time, for example, that Apple refused to use the Flash like standard, I guess, right? For games and online content and stuff like that, right? And what you had with that very basically is, Apple had like a control of a feature, maybe that's not specifically an API in this case, right, that Apple refused to implement on iPhone because they said it's a garbage feature, and yes, sure, down the line it helps them with their business model, but guess what, the original iPhone with like iPhone OS 1.1, 1.0 did not have the Flash player either, because it was trash regardless if there is an App Store or if there isn't an App Store. So they used that to suppress the following technologies, among others: super apps, which provide, oh god, I hate super apps so much. They provide their user with broad functionality in a single app. Think WeChat, right? It's a payment service, it's a messaging service, probably has some kind of content distribution there as well, but think of that when we're talking super apps. Super apps can improve smartphone competition by providing a consistent user experience that can be ported across devices. That is true. This is why in China, WeChat basically dominates everything, and then it doesn't really much matter which hardware you buy, which ironically, even though China is not Apple's like regional own market, they still perform pretty well there. Suppressing super apps harms all smartphone users. They have no idea what smartphone users actually like. The only reason why WeChat is like super successful in China is because China wants WeChat to be super successful. WeChat is not successful because people want super apps. People want a super OS with apps. Good apps, high quality apps, competitive apps. They don't want everything in one app. Their idea of competition is an app that does everything. Oh god. Suppressing super apps harms all smartphone users, including Apple users, by denying them access to high-quality experience. Again, Android is largely an open operating system, and nowhere in the West have super apps taking off on Android. Like, I have no idea what this argument is supposed to say. And it harms developers by preventing them from innovating and selling products. Yeah, I think This is their biggest point over and over again. Like, if certain things basically don't exist because of the App Store, they automatically assume that those things are innovative and would sell. They never ask themselves if some of those things, even with Android existing, which is largely an open platform, which that if that means that maybe people largely reject that, maybe if people choose an iPhone, that means they actually prefer the iPhone way and they don't just buy an iPhone begrudgingly because green bubbles. Cloud streaming game apps provide users with a way to play computing intensive games in the cloud. Cloud streaming games and cloud streaming in general can improve smartphone competition by decreasing the importance of expensive hardware for accomplishing high compute tasks on a smartphone. Suppressing cloud streaming games harms users by denying them the ability to play high compute games, and it harms developers by preventing them from selling such games to users. This has already been addressed. This was part of the DMA in general, but this is a rule that Apple took across the entire world. Previously, cloud gaming apps were limited basically to you had to have every single game that they offered via cloud in the App Store, even if it all led to one app eventually and nobody took them up on it. It was bad user design, bad user interface design basically. And originally I tried to side with Apple, saw how it basically all played out, was then happy that they offered web apps as alternatives, and I believe they even helped some of those companies create those web apps to be very well compatible with Safari and stuff like that. And now they have completely changed that rule, so you can now have native cloud streaming game apps directly on the App Store. So this is entirely null and void worldwide. This should not have been included in a lawsuit that launched yesterday. This is outdated information. Messaging apps are apps that allow users to communicate with friends, family, and other contacts. Messaging apps that work equally well across all smartphones can improve competition among smartphones by allowing users to switch phones without changing the way they communicate with friends, family, and others. Apple makes third-party messaging apps on the iPhone worse generally, and relative to Apple Messages, Apple's own messaging app, by prohibiting third-party apps from sending or receiving carrier-based messages. I can deal with that. I think it's okay to say maybe SMS should be showing up everywhere. I don't think this would change that much, but I can deal with that. I think this is a pretty fair point. By doing so, Apple is knowingly and deliberately... Wait, this is their only example to how they degrade third-party messengers? By doing so, Apple is knowingly and deliberately degrading quality, privacy, and security for its users. Wait, but that does not relate to that and others who do not have iPhones. But this one thing wouldn't change that. Carrier-based messages, which for the vast majority of time basically meant SMS and MMS, do not automatically solve like privacy, security, and quality issues. It's stuff like iMessage, WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal that actually solved a lot of the problems that we usually associate with carrier-based messages. This is factually wrong. Wow, like there's a ton of inconsistency here. Like they clearly don't know, by the way, what they're talking about. Like when we are talking about the green and like blue bubble controversy, we're not talking about including SMS and WhatsApp. We're basically talking either about porting iMessage to all other platforms, or to port some kind of newer carrier-based solution to the Messages app. Like it's, or I mean, you could argue that RCS should also then work with WhatsApp and stuff like that. But this is a very, very irrelevant argument when you actually look at the tech community. This is not what Google was asking for when they created RCS. Not WhatsApp, not Telegram have ever asked for this. This is weird. Apple also harms developers by artificially constraining the size of their user base. What? What? Anybody who's watching, am I missing something here? Like, I mean, this is true for every platform. Apple does not, like, do they think that WhatsApp on iPhone only works with WhatsApp on other iPhone? Like, this statement has nothing. Like, if I were Apple, I would really, like, I would read that to the judge, and then I would ask, like, the lawyers on the side of the DOJ to, or the prosecutors, I guess in this case, to really, can you define to us what you mean by that? And then I would systematically destroy everything they say. What does it mean, Apple? Like, you know, by the way, that this point has like zero merit because it's like the last sentence of this small chapter, and what it does is like it does not fully connect to the rest, nor does it have any kind of follow-up. This is what you write in the hope, like, if you are a smart writer, you will insert a sentence like that somewhere in the middle, in the hope that it basically gets missed. So it does have its effect, but nobody asks for a follow-up. Putting that at the end of this makes it really stand out, and it, like, also harms developers by artificially constraining the size of their user base. That does not apply to messages. You could argue that, like, cross-platform gaming, right, on consoles, for example, is harming developers by either forcing them to pay extra for a cross-platform gaming, right, or by not allowing it outright. Apple, for example, does not do that. You're perfectly fine to do that as a developer. So I have no idea what they mean by that. This is just weird. Okay, and then we get to smartwatches. They're an expensive accessory that is very, very subjective. I mean, $400 is the starting price of a new Apple Watch. An Apple Watch SE is like $280. You can probably find a refurbished Apple Watch SE close to like $250, $220 even. So that is a very emotionally driven statement. It's also not true for the broader market. There are also alternatives, everything from like fitness bands to smart rings and stuff like that. Stuff that all works better with the iPhone, by the way, than other smartwatches. So already a weird statement. Smartphones that can be paired with different smartphones allow users to retain their investment in a smartwatch when switching phones, thereby decreasing the literal cost associated with switching from one smartphone to another. This I can actually see. However, we have to understand, we have actually seen in the beginning of like Android Wear and stuff like that, that you can make smart like watches at least somewhat compatible with iPhone, but it's really, really difficult. In fact, Apple recently outlined how difficult it was to have any attempt to make Apple Watch compatible with Android before they gave up on it. I'll believe it when I like really see it, because I believe they didn't fully try. But yeah, fundamentally, it works best when the native operating system of a smartwatch is written for another OS on the smartphone. It is not like, it's not like CarPlay and Android Auto, right? You cannot just insert anything you want and hope that the smartwatch will be compatible regardless of like operating system and stuff like that. However, from a purely consumer facing argument, I can see that the pricing, for one, the expensive argument, I completely reject. It's entirely subjective. Also, nobody's forced to own a smartwatch. It's unlike a smartphone, which you could consider like a necessity or relevant market even by legal standards. This does not apply to smartwatches, in my opinion. But I do see the argument that when you want to consider switching either your watch or your phone, but you are locked into one OS, this makes it more expensive to make the full switch. Now again, there are some workarounds there, but yeah, I can see the argument. I think it's very poorly worded though. decreasing the literal cost associated with switching from one smartphone to another, among other things. You see, those non sequiturs of like, among other things, this is when you know that they were like, somebody was like trying to explain to a very legal person, like, well, you know, and you have to set up a smartwatch, and you know, like, there are some apps that work on one smartwatch and not the other, right? And you have like the App Store. I tried to do a New Jersey thing, and I don't know what this turned into. I'm sorry. But this person didn't understand any of the other arguments, so they just wrote among other things. This is my complaint here, right? This is poorly written by any metric. By suppressing key functions of third-party smartwatches, including the ability to respond to notifications and messages. Yes, you can receive but not respond to notifications. That is fair. And messages, and to maintain consistent connection with the iPhone. Well, that's not true. You can still maintain a consistent Bluetooth connection the same way you would maintain a consistent Bluetooth connection with any accessory. But I think they mean like the persistent like data sharing that like goes on with the Apple Watch, that is very much optimized for Bluetooth LE, that is very much optimized for Apple's secure and private protocols. The argument is there, and again, it's very poorly understood by the people writing this. Apple has denied users access to high-performing smartwatches with preferred styling, better user interfaces, and services. Again, the uses of the words, this is why I say this is not a legal document, this is an emotional document. They are using one correct word here, right? Preferred. And this is what competition is about. Competition is not always about better, because better is very subjective. Guess what? So is of course preferred, but preferred already implies a level of subjectivity. So what you have here is they should have written, Apple has denied users access to high-performing smartwatches, or I would say to competing smartwatches with preferred styling, user interfaces and services, different batteries, and it has potentially harmed smartwatch developers by decreasing their ability to innovate and sell products. As I said, we'll see that over and over again, like their arguments about competition are far stronger than any of their arguments when it comes to protecting consumers. Like this stuff about better user interfaces and services, better batteries, like who defines that, right? It's like, I mean, they read somewhere that like the Apple Watch has supposedly like small battery life in comparison to some other smartwatches, and never bothered that has everything to do with how smart the Apple Watch actually is, how much it actually does, how vibrant its screen and how big it is and stuff like that. When it comes to actually like battery capacity, it's not like the other smartwatches had like 10 times larger batteries. It's just that they were managing their OS in a different way. Apple was more performance focused and more like immediacy focused, while for the others it was like, look, it's a watch with some fitness functionality and then later on some notification and media control functionality. For Apple, that later stuff actually was the priority. So this about better user interfaces, better services, better batteries, this is highly subjective, and it goes into all this other bullshit that we've also talked about, right? They make one good point, right? Switching is hard. If you buy if you buy an Apple Watch and an iPhone, and if you switch then to an Android, now you have to also consider buying an Android watch, right? But instead, they focus all on this virtue signaling, this, like, guys, this is the biggest tech company you have. The only company larger in terms of like stock valuation is Microsoft, but no company like has the overall like revenue and especially consistent ultra high profit levels as Apple. Like Apple and Microsoft will usually have like their 22 billion of raw profit, but then Apple in like the holiday quarter will like make 30 to 33 billion. So, and you're attacking this company. your main US hardware company when it comes to consumer tech by saying, oh, there's so much stuff that is better. Oh my god, you're such morons. Digital wallets, this is what I've said. This is an argument I can actually agree on. Digital wallets are not that difficult to actually like break down on why they could be like more open. Again, I've said time and time again, I do prefer an implementation that works entirely through Apple. And I think that a lot of banks and services have actually found that consumers trust them more and spend more if they can integrate it the way that Apple designed it. By the way, Apple has been one of the most major innovators on the Western markets when it comes to digital wallets. Obviously, Japan is like the country that has had similar tech for years and years before, like the iPhone 6 and broader NFC rollouts in the West. But the way Apple specifically implemented those technologies, the way Apple specifically worked together with banks, this is 100% Apple innovation when it comes to the Western market. The fact that by no word do they ever acknowledge, by the way, those app stores, right? Apple and Steam are some of the progenitors of the current digital markets, right? Digital wallets, again, Apple is being one of the progenitors of that, especially in the West. None of like smartwatches, not only like we can argue that of course there were other smartwatches before the Apple Watch, but the Apple Watch became insanely successful even beyond the market share of the iPhone often. Well, because there's a higher attach rate of iPhone user to Apple Watch than between Android smartphone user to an Android watch. Apple Watches usually like sell like proportionately better to the iPhone worldwide market share than any Android watch does. This is where it gets weird to me, because there is so much obviously missing data here. Now, I understand that they don't have to make their own counterclaims. This is what Apple's lawyers will come into. But they make it excessively easy for Apple here, because if your facts are so easy to attack, then your entire case starts looking weak, right? There's a profound difference between the idea of like, oh, you know, I have some errors, maybe some stuff that I might have formulated too quickly, but some entire foundations of what you wrote are either misleading or outright lies. And this is why I have no problem in admitting, for example, the digital wallets might be a good argument, because everything else is trash. And guess what? Apple already redesigned and rewrote some rules for Apple Pay and digital wallets for the European Union. They would have zero problems just copy pasting that stuff from the DMA stuff onto the United States. So digital wallets are an increasingly important way that smartphones are used, and are a product in which users develop a great deal of comfort and trust, as they typically contain users' most sensitive information. Yes, and Apple has been historically one of the most trusted companies when it comes to dealing with sensitive information in the world. In fact, their only major platform competitor is actually known to be pretty terrible about that, using like user data to feed AI, to feed like their broader search algorithm and stuff like that. This is so stupid. Digital wallets that work across smartphone platforms allow users to move from one smartphone brand to another with decreased frictions, among other things. Apple has denied users access to digital wallets that would have provided a wide variety of enhanced features, and denied digital wallet developers, often banks, the opportunity to provide advanced digital payment services to their own customers. The last one is true, right? Because Apple has not historically offered full NFC access to other companies. But this is not true. Like digital wallets that work across smartphone platforms, the way Apple Wallet works with like a credit card of your choice, like you can still use the same credit card if like a Google Wallet allows you to do that, right? It just depends on what company has what relationship with what bank. Apple has not once made it restricted to banks to offer like their credit cards only to Apple Pay users. In fact, most banks that support Apple Pay also support Google Pay. This is incredibly misleading. Like, you're basically saying, well, if that bank was able to design like its own app deeply integrated into the OS, it would basically guarantee to work on multiple platforms, as opposed to being very likely to work on multiple platforms. But this is a distinction without a real difference. It's like, it's weirdly like unfocused. Okay. By maintaining its monopoly over smartphones, Apple is able to harm consumers in a wide variety of additional ways. For example, by denying iPhone users the ability to choose their trusted banking apps as their digital wallet. Okay, it goes back to that stuff. Apple retains full control both over the consumer and also over the stream of income generated by forcing users to use only Apple authorized products in the digital wallet. That is... The problem with the term Apple authorized products is that it's actually pretty easy to get into the wallet app. So Apple also prohibits the creation and use of alternative app stores. Okay, now we are getting somewhere. To reflect the consumer's preference with respect to security, privacy. This is the problem. You're basically saying that security and privacy could be higher on alternative stores. This, by the way, ignores the fact that anybody who has an iPhone will already send telemetry data to Apple. Right? You can argue that this shouldn't be allowed or anything, right? But this is how most operating system works. It's basically the cost of admission of logging in. Like, you're basically asking, well, if another company comes in, now your data and your stuff will be more secure and private, even though that one intermediary that we've complained about that is historically proven to be actually the most reliable player, well, that intermediary is not even fully gone. They're just not an intermediary. They're somewhere to the side and watching, you know? This is so weird. It's so ahistorical. Like, they don't even, like, you could have mentioned stuff like the Epic Game Store offers like a 12% commission rate to developers as opposed to Apple's 15 or 30%, right? They also offer their technology like their Unreal game engine, which can, especially for game developers, dramatically lower the potential commission they have to pay. And as so happens, those developers would then still be free to also post on the Apple App Store, which overall would reduce their commission rate, even if still like 80 or 90% of their apps would be sold through the App Store. This is the kind of hypothetical you should be arguing. Trying to argue against Apple on the basis of security and privacy is kind of stupid. I'm honestly shocked that they are trying to do it this way. These and many other features would be beneficial to consumers and empower them to make choices about what smartphones to buy and what apps and products to patronize. But allowing consumers, and if you feel like patronizing me, but in the good way, my Patreon link is in the description of this channel. Boom! Best segue ever. But allowing consumers to make their choice is an obstacle to Apple's ability to maintain its monopoly. Again, we have not yet actually explained to people what that monopoly entails, because, as they say, monopoly by itself doesn't even break antitrust. They've said before that what it makes a monopoly illegal is basically employing illegal antitrust malicious practices to enforce that monopoly. So they're going against some of their own arguments. Like, contrary to what a lot of people believe, monopolies, especially in the United States, are by no means illegal. What is illegal is trying to either get a monopoly or maintain a monopoly through means that are then illegal. Of course, this is not the story Apple presents to the world. For decades, Apple branded itself a nimble, innovative upstart. In 1998, Apple co-founder Steve Jobs criticized Microsoft's monopoly and dirty tactics in operating systems to target Apple, which prompted the company to go to the DOJ. By the way, I've talked yesterday about like them talking about the Microsoft case, yeah, this was beyond just the Internet Explorer case. This was a lot about like the platform freedom stuff that was employed by them. I should read up a lot more on that lawsuit. What was there? In hopes of getting Microsoft to play fair, but even at that time, Apple did not face the same types of restrictions it imposes on third parties today. Apple users could use their iPod with a Windows computer, and Microsoft did not charge Apple a 30% fee for each song downloaded from Apple's iTunes store. I think this is a compelling sort of historical argument. Now, Apple has said time and time again that they see smartphones differently, that they put into APIs, into user trust, into one unified ID, makes it worth having those restrictions. And I think the DOJ could argue that because this by itself is not evil, but that Apple is maybe too large to allow that kind of conduct at this point. So I think this is probably their best argument, and it's not even like it's 0.12. Similarly, when Apple brought iPhone to market in 2007, it benefited from competition among component makers and wireless carriers. This has absolutely nothing to do with anything. This, I believe, is just part of self-aggrandizement when it comes to saying, oh, we have kept like wireless carriers competitive, even though the US wireless carrier market is one of the least competitive in the entire world. While Apple's anti-competitive conduct arguably has benefited its shareholders to the tune of over $77 billion in stock buybacks in its 2023 fiscal year alone, this is an emotional argument. Companies are allowed to do stock buybacks these days. Change the law if you don't want stock buybacks. They were illegal at some point. Ask Ronald Reagan, I believe. It comes at a great cost to consumers. Some of those costs are immediate and obvious. And they directly affect Apple's own customers. Apple inflates the price for buying and using iPhones while preventing the development of features like alternative app stores, innovative super apps, cloud streaming games, and secure texting. Again, this is all the same bullshit. I said there are arguments for alternative app stores. I've said time and time again, if you're arguing for alternative app stores, you should be arguing for site loading in general, because at that point there is no functional difference. You just create other intermediaries, at which point you benefit less the consumer, but the companies that want to compete, and that by itself doesn't really help. Innovative super apps largely is a misguided argument that has nothing to do with like smartphone users are actually asking for. Cloud streaming games is already fixed. And secure texting, a completely bullshit argument that I've like destroyed at this point over and over again. Other costs of Apple's anti-competitive conduct may be less obvious in the immediate term, but they are no less harmful and even more widespread, affecting all smartphone consumers. Apple's smartphone monopoly means that it is not economically viable to invest in building some apps like digital wallets because they cannot reach iPhone users. I mean, in the US, you could argue that, but the Android worldwide market share of like 80% really proves this a lie, unless the US wants to make the argument that their internal financial power is so immense that it's a bullshit argument. This would work if Apple had like a 60% market share everywhere else. It just doesn't work that way. In fact, a lot of companies actually try to have stuff like digital wallets on Android devices, and in fact, even like manufacturers have like their own solution, like Samsung Wallet or whatever, and yet people repeatedly chose Google Pay, Google Wallet over those solutions, to the point that those developers stopped making those solutions, or they became like super niche, basically irrelevant to the broader market. This means that innovations fueled by an interest in building the best, most user-focused product that would exist in a more competitive market never get off the ground. Again, super speculative. This is when we get to their argument that they made during the video, which was we're protecting the innovations of tomorrow. They have to rely on this argument over and over again instead of actually using historical arguments, because I believe they haven't actually done the research. They cannot even, like, what was it, like the email app that was rejected by Apple, like Hey or something like that. They could have actually brought that stuff up and made like compelling arguments that would have involved also like inviting people for testimony and stuff like that. Now I believe they'll still do a lot of that, but they should, this, we're at page 11, this should have been at this point in the report. What's more, Apple itself has less incentive to innovate because it has insulated itself from competition. In what, as Apple executives openly acknowledge, in looking at it with hindsight, I think going forward, we need to set a stake in the ground for what features we think are good enough for the consumer. I would argue we're already doing more than what would have been good enough, but we find it very hard to regress our product features year over year. Existing features would have been good enough today if we hadn't introduced them already. Okay. And anything new and especially expensive needs to be rigorously challenged before it's allowed into the consumer phone. This is true for every company. Like this is like an infinite growth argument, right? The idea that Apple should be competing anywhere and everywhere as long as they're not successful enough. But they themselves are saying, look, guys, we are big enough. We cannot grow our teams that much to create more apps, more services, more hardware products, because at some point we will either not sell those products because we have created stupid products, or we will actually be at the risk of making our other products worse because we spread ourselves thin. This is not an anti-competitive argument. And anything new and especially expensive needs to be rigorously before it's allowed in the consumer phone. Yeah. This is basically Apple's, anybody who knows that ad, right? It's 1,000 no's for every yes. This is a good argument for like good internal practices. Like look, for example, at the gaming market where companies have like overhired by like 20-30% during the pandemic because they believed that that growth would continue forever. And guess what? It didn't, because of course it didn't. But Apple is saying like, guys, we cannot do everything all at once. Yeah, we might be one of the richest companies on the earth, but for example, us competing with like Windows, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, does it really make sense at this point? We have like Pages, Keynote, and Numbers, and they work well and they are arguably good enough, but they don't generate money for us, so why should we compete? And by the way, most users who have like Microsoft Office don't pay Apple a 30% commission, so it's not like Apple gets rich off that. This is so weird. It's like this has nothing to do with their antitrust policies. This is one of the worst quotes to use. I could name you like half a dozen quotes that are better. Thus, it is not surprising that Apple spent more than twice as much on stock buybacks and dividends as it did on research and development. Yes, this has, by the way, this is a problem for Apple because Apple has one of the industry's highest free cash flow rates ever. Like, literally, the way Apple generates profit is insane. Revenue is high, super high. But it's Apple's free cash flow that has really helped them reach the heights where they are now, right? And Apple was like in the position where they were sitting on 150 billion, sometimes more, of like real cash, basically, or free market equivalents of cash. And so they had to put it somewhere. malware, the problem with research and development is you cannot just put more money into research and development, right? You absolutely can put in more money into research and development, but you cannot like double and triple it because at some point you have more money. Like research and development has to be somewhat proportional to your intermediate plans, to your long-term plans. You cannot just say, oh, we just magically put in like another 5 billion into the Apple car and now we had to cancel it, right? Those things have to be smartly considered. This is an attack on the basic like capitalist free market principles. And I'm a social democrat with slight like democratic socialist tendencies. Believe me, I am not the biggest defender of late stage capitalism, but I'll be a hardcore defender for a company's rights to spend its money in legal ways after paying taxes the way they want. Like, what kind of bullshit argument is that? A ton of companies did the same thing. Moreover, Apple has demonstrated its ability to use its smartphone monopoly. Once again, they do not back this term up, they just use it. They should have called it an App Store monopoly, a services monopoly, an API monopoly, but Apple does not have a functional smartphone monopoly. That is just not true. To impose fee structures and manipulate app review to inhibit aggrieved parties from taking advantage of regulatory and judicial solutions imposed on Apple did attempt to narrowly remedy harm from its conduct. Now, I have said time and time again, and you can actually go to my video where I've covered the DMA, is that I am for the creation of an independent commission that handles not app review in of itself, but basically complaints by developers about app reviews. Now, I believe this should be a large board. I believe it should be responsible for large platform holders, the likes of Apple, Google, Microsoft, like with the console, Sony, Nintendo, I guess, right? And whenever something gets like hardcore rejected, it gets like a lot of support by the community. As I said, with like the Hey email app, they should then intervene. But this is a very, very broad statement, and it's very, very like emotionally loaded here. Like, manipulate the app review, like it's their app review. It's, like, again, there should be like concrete examples given here, there should be like quotes given here. Like, if you can quote this, you can quote like the Hey email guys or whatever. Apple wraps itself in a cloak of privacy, security, and consumer preferences to justify its anti-competitive conduct. God, like, this is one of your biggest companies, America, and you're basically attacking their biggest talking points, which, by the way, are true. Apple has historically, like, iOS has been more private and secure than Android. This is not like a debate. We can argue maybe there could have been like a third competitor that was more private and secure, but like, this is an objective fact. There is more malware written for Android. There is more malware and like frauds in the Google Play Store, obviously even more so once you consider stuff like APK downloads from the web. Privacy, not only is there like a platform holder difference where Google likes a lot of data for AI stuff, Apple does not care about data as much, but also beyond that, Apple has introduced repeatedly innovations or just like more aggressive terms to protect privacy. Everything from like the little stickers you see below an app on the App Store that shows you what kind of data it uses and stuff like that. And consumer preference. I mean, consumer preference is subjective. Apple appeals to consumer preference. They do not actually say that consumer preference is like their justification. Like, they're saying we care about privacy and security, which is why we do X. You might call it anti-competitive conduct, but the result of doing X is maintaining privacy and security, and that is a consumer preference. So, like, again, the logical like circle here is not quite complete. Indeed, it spends billions on marketing and branding. By the way, Apple has one of the lower marketing budgets for any company of its size, and branding to promote the self-serving premise that yeah, of course marketing is self-serving. Like, what kind of like emotional bullshit is that only Apple can safeguard consumer privacy and security interests? This is not how marketing works. Apple does not attack other companies in their ads, which, by the way, would still be legal in the United States. But they never say they're the only safeguard. They're just pointing out how good the iPhone is for that. They've had like those Las Vegas like big ads where it basically says only on iPhone, like only in Vegas. Like what you do on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. Apple selectively compromises privacy and security interests when doing so is in Apple's own financial interest, such as degrading the security of text messages. I've already talked how bullshit this is. Again, RCS did not even exist for most of the time that iMessage existed. Offering governments and certain companies the chance to access more private and secure versions of app stores. No, it's about more curated versions of like basically it's like with developers. Obviously, through your developer account you can throw your own app onto the iPhone with Xcode and stuff like that, and then big company organizations have like their own management tools, which by the way mostly happens through Apple itself, and then through that I believe that you can have some company internal apps that then work that way, but that app would also be permissible in the App Store. It's the actual company and government that doesn't want that app to be on the App Store. This is so misguided. They don't understand anything about tech, or accepting billions of dollars each year for choosing Google as its default search engine. Again, this is a bilateral deal, and I have said this deal is somewhat iffy. But what does that mean? When more private options are available, what does that even mean? Like, should Apple have made a deal with DuckDuckGo? Apple is not a privacy-only company. Of course, Apple acts in their own financial self-interest. The reason why Apple advertises security and privacy is because their security and privacy is superior over the competition. That doesn't mean their security and privacy is absolute. Also, by the way, privacy when it comes to search engines is a very fecal matter. You can argue that with VPNs and stuff like that, you can actually be 100% private even using Google. The problem is with Google is actually when you log in. It's once you start trusting them where the problem arises. In the end, Apple deploys privacy and security justifications as an elastic shield that can stretch or contract to serve Apple financial business interests. Yes, every company does that, and every oil and gas company like protects the environment until it gets just a tad too expensive, and then they use like that oil tanker that maybe shouldn't be in use anymore. Like, yeah, companies do shit, including stupid shit, but like none of that is actually illegal. Smartphones have so revolutionized American life that it can be hard to imagine a world beyond the one that Apple, a self-interested monopolist, deems good enough. Dude, it's one of the companies that created that market. It's one of your largest companies. Where is this hatred coming from? What communist wrote this? This is nothing on Marx's Communist Manifesto. This is a hatred against free business practices. I have never read something like this in a legal document. Look, legal documents can sometimes be a lot, right? They can be emotional, they can be a little too much. But like, really, you will never acknowledge Apple's historical contribution to any of those markets? Smartwatches, smartphones, iPods, digital music stores. Like, really? And apparently anything is good enough, because yes, this is what we know from this quote, is that Apple only does things that are good enough, even though, by the way, anybody who knows the term like minimally viable product, right, that is before a product can come to launch, it has to hit certain like quality criteria and stuff like that internally. Apple has historically had some of the highest levels of minimally viable products in the industry, to, I believe, the fact that they don't even use that term, because they work on stuff for so much longer, they iterate on it for so much more cycles. Like, this appeal to like, oh, Apple is only a good enough company, it ignored, like, they could have had such a better argument by saying like, Apple is using their historical successes to not give an inch to potential upcoming competitors and to innovations of tomorrow, because at some point they were the innovators, but at this point maybe they are not, right? We shouldn't leave it to Apple to decide what companies can emerge in the future, just as Apple was allowed to emerge in the 1970s, in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. This is the argument you should be making. By wording everything like this, you make it look as if Apple is like the barely minimum product company, which is just not how people see it. This is not how any judge will see it. This is stupid. But under our system of antitrust laws, good enough is quite simply not enough. This has nothing to do with that. That quote that they've used has absolutely nothing to do with antitrust. If consumers, competition, and the competitive process, not Apple alone, should decide what options consumers should have. I agree with that, and as I've said, there can be remedies for that. Everything from lower commission rates to enforcing different rules on the App Store to maybe even asking for complete site loading or at least alternative marketplaces. But you can argue for all of this in a far better way, and again, all of what I'm saying is arguing. I want those things to be written into law, and I don't want them to be enforced through regulatory agencies like that, with ones that often have no understanding of what they're writing, because a lot of people complain about like lobbyists, right? But fact of the matter is, most of those people are complete dumbasses outside their own like level of expertise and area of expertise. And don't get me wrong, their area of expertise is very, very high and very, very impressive. Those are very smart people, just not when it comes to tech, not when it comes to tech history, not when it comes to contemporary technology, not when it comes to the broader tech market and how competition in it works, not when it comes to analyzing like user surveys and like market share analysis and understanding what consumers actually are asking for. Like, none of that is playing any role here thus far, and we are at page 13. And competition, not Apple's self-interested business strategies, should be the catalyst for innovation essential to our daily lives, not only in the smartphone market, but in closely related industries like personal entertainment, automotive. Oh, we'll get to that at some point, because they even argue in this bullshit at some point that cars, right, that Apple CarPlay is a sign of Apple's like monopolistic behaviors. Even though CarPlay can work on cars that also support Android Auto, on cars that are even built on like Android Car or whatever, like the actual OS. And like, Apple has not once prohibited a car manufacturer from offering both. I have no idea how they want to try to like. Oh, and by the way, this is contrary to the like really clear fact that cars sell well with or without CarPlay or Android Auto. It's just that people want CarPlay because it's a compelling feature. This is where user choice goes to die, guys. Because at some point you will want the manufacturer to implement something, but they'll be stubborn and they'll go to like the DOJ and say like, look, the fact that people are asking me to implement this feature means there's a monopolist behind this feature. No, that's not how it works. Sometimes a feature is good enough and you have to license it from somebody else, or you have to try to recreate it in some ways. And even more innovations that have not yet been imagined. Again, protecting the innovations of tomorrow. Competition is what will ensure that Apple's conduct and business decisions do not thwart the next Apple. Yes, this is true. This is the one good argument that they have, which somehow they put it at the end of Article 17. 18. Protecting competition and the innovation that competition inevitably ushers for consumers, developers, publishers, content creators, and device manufacturers is why plaintiffs bring this lawsuit under Section 2 of the Sherman Act to challenge Apple's maintenance of its monopoly over smartphone markets, which affect hundreds of millions of Americans every day. So let us, if it accepts me for some reason, I guess. So, Sherman Act, US. Well, let's see. We can actually read it. Broad and sweeping in scope, Article 1 of the Act states that every contract combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or foreign nations is declared to be illegal. And now we get to the main point, which they're quoting. Article 2 of the Sherman Act prohibits monopolization or attempts at monopolizing any aspect of interstate trade or commerce and makes the act a felony. Really? That's what they're quoting? It kind of doesn't sound like it. In the lawsuit under Section 2, okay, this is Section 2 of the, I guess what we read was Article 2. In insurance law, am I getting something wrong here? Because this says like article or paragraph, right? 15 U.S. Code, monopolizing trading a felony. Sherman Act, Section 2. Okay, yeah, this is it. Every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or personas to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states, so it's basically all states, okay, or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony, and then conviction thereof should be punished by a fine. Okay, now this is actually interesting. How much? Not exceeding $100 million if a corporation or if any other person $1 million, or by imprisonment not exceeding 10 years, or by both said punishments in the discretion of the court. Okay, so the highest we are probably will see as a punishment is $100 million, and then remedies based on the act, and maybe Tim Cook gets into jail for 10 years if you want to believe that, if you are naive and don't know how anything works. Protecting under Section 2 of the Sherman Act to challenge Apple's maintenance of its monopoly over smartphone markets, which affect hundreds of millions of Americans every day. Plaintiffs bring this case to rid smartphone markets of Apple's monopolization and exclusionary conduct, and to ensure that the next generation of innovators can upend the technological world as we know it with new and transformative technologies. Okay, so this was basically the introduction, right? And now we'll be getting to defendant Apple. Afterward, Apple launches the iPod, iTunes, and the iTunes Store against the backdrop of United States v. Microsoft. United States v. Microsoft. I want to make sure that I'm not getting any of this wrong. Yeah, it was about Internet Explorer, but it was about more than that, right? But there's very little in this case that like really like it leads up to like the introduction of the iPod from a pure like timeline perspective, but it doesn't actually like really have anything to do with like how iTunes worked on Windows, or it doesn't. It was a landmark American antitrust law. I see I'm slowly turning into like the destiny of the tech community by reading like egregiously long legal documents into Wikipedia online. Um, entered the United Courts of Appeals for the District of Columbia. The U.S. government accused Microsoft of illegally monopolizing the web browser market share for Windows with Internet Explorer. This is all stuff I know. District Court trial judgment. Judge Jackson issued his findings of fact on November 5th, 1999, holding that Microsoft's dominance of the x86-based personal computer operating system market constitute a monopoly, and that Microsoft had taken actions to crush threats to that monopoly, including applications from Apple, Java, Netscape, Lotus Software, Real Networks, Linux, and others. On April 3, 2000, Jackson issued his conclusions of law, holding that Microsoft had engaged in monopolization, attempted monopolization, and tying in violation of sections 1 and 2 of the Sherman Antitrust. Tying is the practice of selling one product or service as a mandatory addition to the purchase. Okay, so it's basically how Amazon Prime works. In legal terms, a tying sale makes the sale of one good to the de facto customer conditional on the purchase of a second distinctive good. Tying is often illegal when the products... Yes? Tying is often illegal when the products are not naturally related. It is related to but distinct from freebie marketing, a common and legal method of giving away or selling at a substantial discount one item to ensure continual flow of sales or of another related item. Yep, by the way, this is what kind of like 3 free months of like Apple Music or Apple Arcade are for you. Like this is freebie marketing, especially because it's actually free and it's not like fully bundled together. I actually thought that tying was called bundling. Was I wrong about that, or are those just synonyms, or is it me mistaking the law? The company doing this bundling, okay, in marketing, product bundle is not. Okay, so I guess bundling is not like a legal term necessarily. In marketing, product bundling is offering several products or services for sale as one combined product. It is a common feature in many imperfectly competitive product and service markets. Industries engaged in practice include telecommunication service, financial service, so basically everyone. Okay, so tying is basically an illegal form of bundling then? Tying sales make the sale tying's often okay. So tying is basically the often illegal version of something like bundling, but then freebie marketing is the basically mandatory legal version of that. And tying basically is distinct in the way that the products that are bundled together are not necessarily like naturally related. However you want to define that. Interesting. And I guess for Microsoft, the tying was between like Windows itself and the Internet Explorer browser, which also gave it, because Windows had such a high market share, that resulted in the bundled solution also getting a really high market share, and that kept companies like Apple, Java, Netscape, Lotus Software, Real Networks back from making their own browsers actually successful, right? That's how I understand this lawsuit. On June 7, 2000, the district court ordered a breakup of Microsoft as its remedy. According to the judgment, Microsoft would have to be split into two separate units, one to produce the operating system and one to produce other software components. Did it actually work? Microsoft immediately appealed the judgment. Well, that is a stupidly aggressive move, though. After Microsoft filed its appeal, the US government and the states in the suit requested a process that would skip the intermediate circuit court and send the case directly to the US Supreme Court. Such an action is permitted. It gives blah, blah, blah. The states also filed a petition for certiorari for judgment. That's a lot of legal terms, especially from the US, that I simply do not know. This is what I know, by the way. This is why I was surprised that this was even suggested. On June 28, 2001, the Circuit Court overturned Judge Jackson's rulings against Microsoft. This was partly because Jackson had improperly discussed the case with the news media. Awesome. While it was still in progress, violating the code of conduct for American judges. This does not violate, I believe, though, the code of conduct for U.S. Supreme Court justices, unfortunately. The Circuit Court judges accused Jackson of unethical conduct and determined that he should have recused himself from the case. Thus, the Circuit Court adopted a drastically altered scope of liability due to Jackson's conduct, which was favorable for Microsoft. Jackson's response was that Microsoft conduct itself was the cause of any perceived bias Microsoft executives had, according to him. Proved time and time again to be inaccurate, misleading, evasive, and transparently false. Ultimately, the Circuit Court overturned Jackson's holding that Microsoft should be broken up. It's an illegal monopoly. However, the Circuit Court did not overturn Jackson's finding of fact. The case was remanded back to the DC District Court. And then what we see here, that they didn't ask anymore to break up Microsoft, and they wanted a lesser antitrust penalty. And so they settled the case on November 1st, 2001. And I believe this is where we got like the like infamous like pop-up page that suggested other browsers to you, right? The proposal required Microsoft to share its application programming interfaces with third-party companies, appoint a panel of 3 people who would have full access to Microsoft systems records and source code for 5 years in order to ensure compliance. However, the DOJ did not require Microsoft to change any of its code. I don't believe that this will be the case for Apple. I do believe that this will also be the case for Apple. Changing of code, especially in the United States, can have the legal problem that this is basically a free speech impairment, in the sense that forcing you to change your code can be seen as a violation of the First Amendment. Nor did it prevent Microsoft from tying other software with Windows in the future, which I wish they had, at least in some way, not because of anti-competitive reasons, but for quality reasons. I just don't want Teams pre-installed. On August 5th, 2002, Microsoft announced that it would make some concessions toward the proposed final settlement. This is where I think we get like that pop-up thing. So the criticism here, Andrew Chen, an antitrust law professor at the University of North Carolina, wrote that the settlement gave Microsoft a special antitrust immunity to license Windows and other platform software under contractual terms that destroy freedom of competition. Yeah, so basically a lot of people argue that this doesn't go far enough. And one can argue that it didn't at that time. Like, it never hurt like Microsoft like operating system market share that much. It hurt like their browser market share. But yeah, by the way, the fact that they are constantly talking about United States v. Microsoft without acknowledging that this was primarily about like bundled software is really weird. Apple invited third-party investment. Yeah, we know all this. Smartphones are platforms. Nobody said otherwise. Apple unlawfully maintains its monopoly power, API, and then they describe anti-competitive effects and stuff like that. So, defendant Apple, and I think before we wrap this up in around like 20 minutes, I think this is probably worth going through because I really want to see how they describe Apple. Apple is a global tech company with headquarters in Cupertino, California. Apple is one of the world's most valuable public companies with a market capitalization of over 2.5 trillion. That's correct. It's currently at like 2.6 and a half. It was at over 3 trillion at some point. But guess what? This lawsuit is one of the reasons why it dropped, for example, from like 2.7 to now 2.65 or something like that. Angelica, hi. In fiscal year 2023, Apple generated annual net revenues of $383 billion and net income of $97 billion. Apple's net income exceeds any other company in the Fortune 500 and the gross domestic products of more than 100 countries. Yeah, you know what would be smart to do so before you try to actually like deconstruct their success? How about you actually try to create like both worldwide and domestic tax policies that actually make sure that those $97 billion might be more like $60 billion after tax and stuff like that. This is... I never understood that sometimes. I feel like that those regulatory agencies and stuff like that, they do not hold any actual power in the broader sense, and lawmakers refuse to like write new laws, change tax legislation as we know it. So they attack the companies themselves like one by one, and in the end it never changes the core system. It never actually benefits like the broader citizenship. What it does, it hurts one company a little bit, and then it benefits another company, and then the game just changes, right? It's like the Game of Thrones quotes from Khaleesi when she said like the wheel, it's like Baratheons, the Lannisters, like and the wheel like spins on and on, like they just trampling everyone under the ground under this wheel. One takes the power from another, kills somebody else, but fundamentally like the little folk, they never see any benefit that somebody else is on top of the wheel. So her solution would be to break the wheel. Now, breaking the wheel would probably completely entail like destroying our modern capitalist system, which I'm not in favor for, but probably do something to make sure that a company cannot generate $97 billion of net revenue on $383 billion of almost $100 billion of net income on $383 billion of net revenue. Maybe make sure that that is then closer to 50 or something like that. And suddenly all those monopolistic practices will hurt a lot less. The iPhone, Apple's signature product, is the primary driver of Apple's growth and profitability, routinely commanding profit margins of more than 30% on devices alone. That is true. Significantly higher than its smartphone competitors. Yes and no. Then basically every smartphone competitor, yes. It has to you have to understand that Apple smartphones are also more expensive than most other smartphones. You can argue that other smartphones in that price range might have not maybe quite close 30% margins, but maybe 20% margins, right? It's where they go into like the $400 price segment, where actually like 95% of their sales exist, is where they get to like 2 or 3% profit margins. It's why I believe Xiaomi for years advertised themselves as like a 5-6% profit margin company, because they're like closely related to like the CCP and stuff like that, basically saying, oh look, we are so moral, our devices have like low profit margins. But we also see that anytime a company is actually given the opportunity to take higher profit margins, that's what they do. That's how the market is actually also supposed to fix itself. Because if one company gets too big for its bridges, Apple, Nvidia, whatever you want, and then they ask higher profit margins, this gives now the opportunity for another company to swoop in and offer you a cheaper product with lower profit margins, but still a sustainable profit. If Apple was asking 10% profit margin, Apple would probably have an 85% market share in the United States, and nobody else would even be generating even the slightest bit of profit. You know how like those charts sometimes show Apple and Samsung together make like 110, 120% of the industry's profits? That's because a lot of companies, especially at the time when HTC and LG still existed, those companies were actually in the red. They were in the negative. This is how you get to like 110, 120% of combined profit. So what I'm asking is, this is not an actual complaint. I mean, this is the truth, but they're clearly trying to make it look evil and bad. iPhone sales have made up a majority of Apple's annual revenue ever since 2012. Apple increasingly extracts revenue from iPhone users beyond the initial smartphone sale. Yes, this is called a virtuous cycle, when you can sell both hardware and software. This is where you be really successful. This is why Nvidia doesn't just sell GPUs to the server market. They sell them and software tools for them and stuff like that. So it's by no means unique. It's by no means antitrust monopoly, like danger zone, the second you see that somebody monetizes a product beyond the initial sale. For example, Apple offers iPhone upgrades. I mean, that is a smartphone sale. Absent in-app payments, okay. Paid digital subscription service, including their own, like Apple Music, TV, news, gaming, fitness, cloud storage, accessories, tracking devices. I bet they call them that to make them look evil. Headphones, chargers, iPhone cases, and more. Apple refers to those offerings as services, wearables, homes, and accessories, respectively. Yep, this is when you look at Apple's like financial statements every quarter. They call this that. In fiscal year 2023, this offerings accounted for nearly 1/3 of Apple's total revenue. By the way, all of that stuff also exists on other Apple stuff. Like Apple's other services exist on iPad and Mac and Apple TV. And obviously, like wearables are not just iPhone accessories. Like I know even people who own like AirPods with an Android device. You can technically even own like an Apple Watch without an iPhone. You just have to activate it with an iPhone. Like I've done that for a friend, and she has been fine with using an Apple Watch like that for 2 years. This is... Yes, I guess if you can say like the iPhone is the biggest part of Apple, then everything else sort of services the iPhone, but that is not entirely true. These offerings accounted for nearly 1/3 of Apple's total revenue, or 4 times what Apple earned from selling Mac computers. Some of the largest drivers of revenue within these categories are Apple's Smartwatch, the Apple Watch, and Apple's App Store, where iPhone users purchase and download apps. Yeah, sure. In recent years, services have accounted for increasing share of Apple's revenues, especially of Apple's profits, while the iPhone has remained the primary gateway through which US consumers access these services. Well, yeah, because it's larger than iPad and Mac, but it's not unique. Also, like stuff like even Apple TV Plus and Apple Music are available on a lot of other hardware at this point. Obviously, iCloud is available through the web. In fact, a lot of like iCloud related services are available through the web. Even stuff like iWork exists on the web. So, I mean, sure, you can argue that it's best used through an iPhone and that it's most commonly used through an iPhone, but it's not like there aren't other solutions. Apple's US market share by revenue is over 70% in the performance smartphone market, a more expensive segment of the broader smartphone market that we just defined for ourselves, I guess, where Apple's own executives recognize the company competes, and over 65% for all smartphones. Well, no. Apple, 65% is a lot. Like 60, I can see it's more like 55. they would really need quotations for this and stuff like that. These market shares have remained remarkably durable over the last decade. Apple's smartphone market shares understate Apple's dominance and likely growth in key demographics, including among younger American consumers. For example, 1/3 of all iPhone users in the United States were born after 1996. I was born in 1996, as compared to just 10% for Samsung, Apple's closest smartphone competitor. Okay, what is that telling us? Surveys show that as many as 88% of US teenagers expect to purchase an iPhone for their next smartphone. iPhone users also tend to come from higher income households. Yes, because those phones are more expensive. Because smartphone users generally use a single smartphone to access related products and services, looking up key user groups allows Apple to capture greater spending on iPhone-related products and services, realize higher margins per users as compared to smartphone rivals. Yep, this is how success looks like. And exercise greater control over developers and other smartphone ecosystem participants. In fiscal year 2023, Apple spent $30 billion on research and development. By comparison, Apple spent $77 billion on stock buybacks during the same year. Again, emotional argument, nothing legal or illegal about it. Apple could have spent $40 billion or $50 billion. They would have still made an emotional appeal that stock buybacks are higher. Apple could have spent about 1-to-1, and then they would have argued that it's too much to spend 1-to-1. Those kinds of comparison numbers, always look out for this and ask yourself, even if there was like a 2-to-1 shift between them, right? Would they still be making that argument? And if they are, then ask yourselves if maybe there's a strong bias here. Apple was founded in 1976. Well, now I know that. During its first 25 years, the company focused in large part on producing and marketing personal computers. Although the market for PCs expanded over the next several decades, Apple struggled to gain customer adoption for its higher-priced products relative to its lower-cost competitors, including IBM and Microsoft. In the late 1990s, Apple significantly restructured the company and embarked on a new strategy focused on just selling personal computers, not just on selling personal computers, but also consumer devices like the iPod. I mean, this ignores the fact that like the 1998 iMac was like a smash success. That by the time the iPod launched, we had like G3 Macs everywhere and stuff like that. Like, I mean, yeah, they never led like to the heights of the iPhone, but like also like the iPod led to the development of the iPhone. It's this old logic of like one thing led to another. It's like, for example, the iPhone did not lead to the development of the iPad. In fact, they were developed sort of side by side. And then just technological reality and just internal preferences resulted in them prioritizing the iPhone. But then 3 years later, they brought out the iPad. So yes, of course, the iPod brought in enough money, brought in more people that then worked on the iPhone, but it's not as easy as they make it sound. And now we get to Apple's like supposedly legal like underpinnings in their case versus like not even their case versus Microsoft, but United States v. Microsoft. This is where I would like to end this. I would read a few chapters, and then once I find some kind of logical ending to what they're writing, I would like to wrap up because I have to prepare for like a long train trip tomorrow. Thank you anyone who tuned in. Thank you to anyone who watched yesterday's video. So let's read this for now. Apple launched iPod, iTunes, and iTunes Store against the backdrop of United States v. Microsoft. When Apple began developing mobile consumer devices, the iPod in this case, it did so against the backdrop of US v. Microsoft, which created new opportunities for innovation in areas that would become critical to the success of Apple's consumer devices and the company itself. For example, the iPod did not achieve widespread adoption until Apple developed a cross-platform version of the iPod and iTunes for Microsoft Windows OS, at the time the dominant operating system for personal computers. In the absence of the constant decree in United States v. Microsoft, it would have been more difficult for Apple to achieve the success and ultimately launch the iPhone. That is not true. The United States v. Microsoft lawsuit, as we just read before, was basically about the de facto control by Microsoft. It wasn't that they prohibitively struck down every competitor. It's that the success of Windows fueled the success of Internet Explorer, fueled their broader control over the early web and stuff like that. It wasn't about the fact that they were prohibiting other applications from launching on Windows overall. There was never a problem with launching the iTunes Store app on Windows. That is simply not true. Like, this is speculation. You're saying in the absence of the consent decree, it would have been more difficult. I mean, they could have said it could have been more difficult, but there's no legal justification for that. That's not what the lawsuit was all about. On May 18th, 1998, the Justice Department and the Attorney General of 19 states and the District of Columbia filed U.S. v. Microsoft, an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft, alleging that the company had violated Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which we just read, which is about monopolizing or trying to monopolize or trying to uphold a monopoly. By monopolizing the market for Intel-compatible personal computer OS, computer operating system. At trial, the government successfully established that Microsoft took steps to undermine the competitive threats posed by middleware, such as web browsers like Netscape, after it recognizes that if users could use middleware to access a variety of content and services via remote servers over the internet, they might be less reliant on Windows. Yes, but Microsoft did not fully take down those apps. Did they? They tried to undermine them by making everything like Internet Explorer reliant. Microsoft also took steps to undermine cross-platform technologies like QuickTime, a software architecture developed by Apple to play multimedia content, like music and videos on Apple's Mac computers and Microsoft Windows PCs. In particular, Apple's then Senior Vice President of Software Engineering testified that Microsoft wrote steps into its OS to ensure that the QuickTime file will not operate reliably on Windows. Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, now I get that. Yeah, this, I should have pointed out. I don't know if this is, by the way, true. You can make the argument that just with subsequent, whenever Windows got any kind of major updates, they basically made sure it was best written for their own software, and including browser stuff like Netscape and even Apple's QuickTime solution were basically crap. I don't know if that means that they deliberately had something in the code that would specifically mix up QuickTime. Again, I should go back and read some of the old things about US v. Microsoft, but they don't allege Apple is doing any of that. They're saying Apple basically does not even have to do any of that because of what they called contractual restrictions and fees and selectively restricting access for third parties. That they trick the user into believing the QuickTime technology is part of the problem actually caused by the Windows OS and introduce greater technical incompatibilities between QuickTime and Microsoft products. Yes, but this is why Microsoft was then forced, as we read, to show basically their APIs to an independent group of experts and make sure that they weren't writing anything into the OS to mess up other apps. But none of that was ever alleged for Apple. For Apple, it's basically that they by default restrict apps, but people know that. People don't get tricked into thinking that an app fails on iPhone or isn't on iPhone because the developers screwed up. They know that often it will come down to Apple's rules and regulations. Apple is far more open about all of this than Microsoft was. What Microsoft was doing was basically a malicious compliance with any kind of anti-monopoly law by allowing those applications, but then by creating software that either deliberately or sort of accidentally screwed that software up. In April 2000, the trial court ultimately found that Microsoft's conduct violated Section 2 of the Sherman Act. An appeals court upheld the district court's finding of liability regarding middleware. In January 2001, Apple introduced iTunes software. Oh, so they're making the argument that Microsoft would have in the OS built something that like destroyed iTunes, the way they tried to harm QuickTime. Okay, I still think this is a little bit far-fetched, but now that they've laid it out a little better, I can accept that. At least I will not believe it, but I can at least accept it as a kind of like argumentative, like logical chain. And advertise it as jukebox software for organizing and listening to music. The initial version of iTunes was only compatible with Apple's Mac computers. Yes, but the reason for that is because the Mac is Apple's own computer, so any kind of software will be by definition written first for it. This is just blatantly how preference works for companies. Later the same year, Apple debuted the iPod, a portable digital audio player that worked alongside iTunes to let you put your entire music collection in your pocket and listen to wherever you go. Like iTunes, the initial iPod was only compatible with Mac computers. Yes, that's because software gets written first. You can either delay software until you have written a port for another OS, or you can release it first as an exclusive for your own OS, and then later down the line, introduce a high-quality port to another OS. This is not anti-competitive practices. They make it seem like Apple is here doing something evil, even though it's like a completely like bog standard like practice. On November 1st, 2002, I believe this is what we've read on Wikipedia, the trial court accepted a proposed consent decree in the United States v. Microsoft. Among other things, the consent decree prohibited Microsoft from retaliating against companies for developing or distributing products such as browsers and media players. The consent decree also required Microsoft to make various APIs available to third-party developers, including Apple. Yes, and I believe that you could argue that a good outcome of this like lawsuit would be like potentially allowing third-party marketplaces or full-on site loading, maybe opening up the wallet app to just other solutions from banks and such. I think the green bubble stuff is bullshit. The cloud streaming stuff is already been fixed. I think this has always been my argument. If you force alternative marketplaces or if you force site loading, then you cannot touch the commission, because then it's just the freedom of markets for Apple to ask any kind of commission they want. But if you don't enforce site loading and alternative marketplaces, then you could argue that this commission could maybe be legally lowered based on revenue and profit margins especially. We'll continue at 33 next time, and hopefully there's some news to report in between. My voice is giving up. I apologize. I had to talk a lot today, so I couldn't do the video for quite as long as I did yesterday. I hope you guys still enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed making it. I very much want to say thank you for anybody who tuned in. I want to say thanks to anyone who checked out yesterday's video. I will not be able to make a video tomorrow because I'm on a small trip. I don't know if I can make one on Sunday, but I can definitely make one on Monday. So thank you so much. We're at 87,000, so we got a few more subscribers from the last video. I'm very, very grateful for that. Let's keep that ball rolling with this one. As always, let me know what you would like to see me cover in the next video or so. As always, let me know if everything works for you in terms of tech stuff in my streams, audio, video quality. I do like this setup where we basically go through something, I take notes, you can see me in the corner, but of course I'm always open to alternative suggestions as well. And beyond that, please like, subscribe, share, comment, all the YouTube jazz as I call it. You can find my Twitter and my Patreon links in the descriptions of this channel. So if you really want to support this content that I'm doing, I would be very, very grateful for that. And of course, if you catch me live, you can send me a super chat or a super sticker. And even if a video has already been uploaded, you can still send me, I believe it's called a super thanks. So that was a lot of outro information. There was a lot of legal stuff and things like that. I hope to catch you guys soon still. I hope to read your comments, to read your tweets and everything else like that. Thank you so much. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.